All right, so let's talk about research strategies that we would use across the developmental spectrum. And you might say, well, why why this part of the lesson if we're talking about clinical disorders? And I would tell you that many conditions, especially conditions in childhood, we can track longitudinally. We can track through time to see the development. And in fact, uh, this class of research is one of the more common class of research we use in childhood psychopathology. So let's go through the four designs that are linked to development. We have a longitudinal design, a cross-sectional design, a sequential design. You might hear it referred to as a cross-sequential, or you might hear it referred to as a cohort sequential design. And then last but not least, we have a concept called a microgenetic design. So let's go into it. So a longitudinal design, by definition, you are studying one group through time. So you're going to be collecting data on one group at many points in time. So you're going to hear my wording, and if you're taking notes, I ask you to underline one group and many times, because that's really what a longitudinal design is. We follow people through time to see whether or not there were any meaningful changes, any aspects of maturation, any aspect of competency that might have been acquired, or any form of deficits relative to what we would expect at that age bracket. So the nice thing about a longitudinal design is that it does have the ability to detect individual differences in development. We also get to compare a single cohort. Now, I want to define what a cohort is. It's a group of people born roughly at the same time, who live through roughly the same experiences. So we get to track cohort effects. We get to see how people develop who were born in a certain era, let's say. And we can see earlier to later experiences and how the environment affects that. Now, longitudinal research, as great as it is that you can follow people through time, there are a lot of challenges when you conduct longitudinal research. The first challenge is that by the time you publish your research study, perhaps your findings become obsolete. What do I mean by that? While you're doing a long-term study and you're collecting data through time, someone might have done a different form of a research study. It was a one-off study, and they published before you. And because they published before you, it is possible that the novelty of your finding has been tainted. And as a function of that, some journals will say, no, we already know this. You're not adding anything new to the science. So that's one issue about the data becoming obsolete between point A and point B. We also have to be mindful of how we recruit participants. It is possible that our sampling techniques have some form of bias, and the interpretations that we draw could be skewed because of how we sampled. We also have the concept of selective attrition. When you have a single group and people are dropping out of the study, we don't know why they're dropping out of the study. We might ask, hey, why is that the case? Now, if you have multiple groups, you can detect selective attrition a lot better, because you can compare group A, it seems pretty intact. Group B seems like a lot of people have dropped out, and we might be able to ask, well, why is that? So we have an issue of selective attrition, and with a single group, it's hard to detect why people are dropping out. We also have practice effects. If I'm going to give an assessment to a group many points in time, it is possible that the repeated exposure to whatever assessment I'm giving could help improve their performance, right? Because similar to if you were an athlete and you were trying to develop a better free throw percentage and you kept practicing and practicing, you would perfect your form. You might get better at how you release the ball and the release angle and the arc and all of these things. Same thing can be said about research. If I give you an IQ test repeatedly, you're going to start to do better on IQ tests because you remember either the questions themselves or some variation of the questions, and that alters performance. So we have to be very careful when collecting data multiple points in time that we don't skew the outcome at point B or C or D. So we have to worry about practice effects. There is another possibility that you don't get better, but there's a deterioration of functioning. So sometimes repeated exposure can hinder performance. And the example that I like to do in terms of athletics would be if a person was working out in weight training and they kept bench pressing over and over and over, their muscles would become fatigued. So similar to that, there is an issue called a fatigue effect in research. Repeated practice or exposure doesn't always increase ability. It could decrease ability. So we have practice effects and we have fatigue effects. We also understand the issue of cohort effects. Now, I said we get to study a group of people that are born roughly at the same point in time, who live through the same cultural experiences or very similar, and we get to track them and we get to understand that group of people. So if you're looking at baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, iGen, things like that, you can see how being born in a certain time period affects an individual. But one of the problems is that if we try to overgeneralize from one cohort to the next, each cohort experiences social events, life events differently. And the outlook could be very different. So maybe the results that we have is because we were dealing with cohort A, but if we were dealing with a different cohort, cohort B, the results could be very different. So we have to be mindful of our sample and the cohort itself. So these are some issues related to longitudinal research. So we have an alternative. We have an alternative, which is called a cross-sectional design. Now, listen to how I define this one. We're studying many groups at one point in time. Longitudinal design, we were studying one group at many points in times. This is the exact opposite. We're collecting all our data at one point in time. And because of that, we have a lot of the problems of the longitudinal design addressed. If I am collecting data at one point in time, I no longer have to worry about practice effects. I no longer have to worry about why a person dropped out of my study because I'm only collecting data at one point in time. I no longer have to worry about the data becoming obsolete, right? Because I'm collecting data at one point in time and I'm going to try and write up my publication immediately after. It won't necessarily be 10 years later that I'm publishing my findings, let's say. And because you don't have to track people down and bring them back in, it's certainly more efficient and cost effective. So there are a lot of benefits to a cross-sectional design. Now, one of the challenges is that it doesn't provide the evidence of when development occurred, right? So in a longitudinal design, we're tracking before and after. We can see some kind of maturation or some kind of shift in competency. When we do a cross-sectional design, we're just taking you as you are at that point in time, that singular point in time. So we don't get the evidence about development, maturation, competency, and things like that. The other thing is we talked about cohort effects. They're still there. Just because you're measuring different age groups doesn't mean that the cohort effect is gone. It still could be present. So we still have to be mindful of cohort effects and how that influences the multiple groups. So there is a third approach. A third approach is what we call a sequential design. As I said, you might hear it referred to as a cohort sequential design because you're having multiple groups through time, or you might hear it referred to as a cross-sequential design. So what is a sequential design? It is a combination of a longitudinal and a cross-sectional design. And because it's a combination of the two, you get the best of both worlds. You're now tracking multiple groups through time. So when you're collecting data, you're collecting groups on many groups at many points in time, if we're keeping the words, right? So what are the advantages? Well, we get all of those cross-sectional findings that we would have gotten in a cross-sectional design, and we get all of those developmental or age-related changes across the lifespan, so you get the best of both worlds. Now, because you're studying multiple groups at many points in time, remember the issue of cohort effects? We can prove that there is a cohort effect happening with a sequential design. Now, it doesn't mean that we can get rid of it. If there's a cohort effect, there's a cohort effect. The previous two, we have to worry about whether or not there's a cohort effect. Here, we could definitively say, yes, there is, or no, there isn't a cohort effect. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, here is just a picture I took out of a different book to give you some kind of understanding of longitudinal, cross-sectional, and sequential design. So if you look at the top example, data was collected once, and you're comparing multiple groups at one point in time. So we would refer to that as a cross-sectional design. Whereas a longitudinal design, we are tracking one group at many points in time. And what this picture is suggesting is, generally speaking, we would keep the amount of time even. So if I started with 2-year-olds and I said, okay, I'm going to track every 4 years, the next time you would come in would be at 6 years old, 10 years old, 14, and 18. So now we're tracking one group of people at 5 different time intervals. Does that make sense? So that's what we refer to as a longitudinal design. Now, a cross-sectional design, I said you get the best of both worlds. So you might have that first group that started at 2, then 6, then 10, and 14, and 18. But now you're going to add another group. So you're going to compare in point B, the 2-year-olds versus the 6-year-olds. In point C, you're going to have 2-year-old, 6-year-old, and 10-year-old, and so forth. So now we get to get those longitudinal differences. We get to get those cross-sectional differences, and we get to determine whether or not there's some form of a cohort effect. Very, very cool design. Now, when you are doing longitudinal or cross sequential designs or cohort sequential designs, it is wise to publish your initial findings and then republish 4 years later and say a 4-year follow-up study, an 8-year follow-up study. You see what I mean? And that will reduce the likelihood of your findings becoming obsolete when you publish at multiple points in time. All right. So the last of our developmental designs is what's called a microgenetic design. And it's similar to the observational method where we did time sampling. Remember that, where we said we're going to take a unit of time and break it up into smaller parts. So we're collecting a lot of data in a short period of time. So the microgenetic design is the developmental version of this, in which you are giving a task. Let's say you're studying a child to see when they, I don't know, learn to walk. You might collect data not every 4 years, but you might be collecting data once a week. And because you have these closer spaced sessions or data collection, you're able to detect moment-to-moment changes. You're able to detect that shift of when walking began. So if I were to collect data when you're, I don't know, 6 months, and then collect data when you're 2 years old, yeah, you might be walking, but I wouldn't know when you started walking. With a microgenetic approach, I get to collect data once a week, and I can pinpoint with far more precision when that change took place. So that is a very cool way of actually detecting the growth process and when mastery took place. Okay. We still have problems because we don't know when that change is going to take place. We also have the shorter the distance between two data collections, the more of a practice effect you're going to have. And it is still hard to capture moment-to-moment behaviors. You're going to collect data at shorter intervals, but it is very rare to collect data 24/7. So even in a microgenetic design, we have these 3 considerations: whether or not we're going to capture the moment-to-moment behavior, whether we miss when change is taking place because we couldn't anticipate that change, and practice effects. So these are our 4 developmental-based research designs. I'm going to stop.
Sorry to interrupt, but I have a question.
Yeah. Okay.
In case we did the microgenetic design, we followed the microgenetic design to do some kind of research to confirm, let's say, something, and we missed it. So we publish this study and do another study based on the first one, just to say that we missed this interval, so we're doing a more detailed microgenetic design, or no?
You could, in theory, do that. But if you miss something, you're not missing it by much. Whereas in the longitudinal design, you're missing it potentially by years, the shift. You might be missing this, let's say, by a week. So yeah, you still could miss things, but you're going to have better precision as to when that change took place. Could you do another study where you have in the common areas a camera rolling at all times? You could, but it's going to take a lot of time to review the footage, and it's not very efficient to do so. What I would do is I would follow up a microgenetic design with a cross-sequential design and say, okay, well, I have this understanding that, let's say, walking, people take their first steps at about 12 months. So I might design a cohort sequential, cross-sequential, or just sequential design, they're synonyms, and track. Instead of 4 years, let's say I'll have some people at 8 months, I'll have some people at 10 months, some people at 12 months, and I follow them through time to get averages across the 3 groups to see if I was right with the microgenetic design. Does that answer your question, George?
Yes, makes sense. Thank you so much.
Perfect. So let me stop this recording here. And in our next discussion, we're going to talk about reliability and validity and some basic research ethics.